Welcome back. In the previous film, I talked about my experiences following the birth of my son. Now, the really difficult thing is, if you'd asked me at any point during those few months whether I was struggling with depression, I probably would have said no, which is strange coming from a psychologist, coming from someone who studies psychology and who studies things like depression in men. It seems strange that I, of all people, would say that what I was going through wasn't postnatal depression. I suppose I'd internalized this idea that postnatal depression doesn't affect men, it only affects mums. And this certainly is the view of lots of people, particularly in the UK. And to demonstrate this, there's a very simple task you can do. This is a description of an individual. So this person is 30 years old. They and their partner have had a baby a few weeks ago. Since then, they've been feeling really down. They've not enjoyed things the way they normally would. In fact, nothing gives them pleasure anymore. Even when nice things happen, they don't seem to make this person happy, and they have to force themselves to get through the day. Even the smallest things seem hard to do. They find it really difficult to concentrate on anything. They have no energy at all. And even though they feel tired at night, they still can't sleep. And they wake up too early in the morning. They feel worthless. They feel like giving up. Their family has noticed that something hasn't been the same since the baby was born, but this person doesn't feel like talking and isn't taking part in things like they used to. Now, as I was reading this description, it's useful to kind of think about whether you yourself personally thought this person who was being described was a woman, was a mum or a dad. The kind of thing that I've asked you to do is a very simplified version of a study that my colleagues and I conducted, in which participants were asked to say, where they were shown the identical passage, but they were told one was a version of a dad and one was a version of a mum. When it was the mum, most participants, about 90%, were able to correctly identify that this was a case of postnatal depression. When it was a dad, however, only 46% of people did so. The majority of people who read this passage and believing it to be a man thought it was just either tiredness, stress, or jealousy of a partner. So it seems to be a clear gender divide. When we talk about postnatal depression, we frequently understand it to affect mums, but when the same symptoms, when identical symptoms are applied to men, we seem to dismiss it and we seem to talk about these experiences in terms of more everyday experiences like tiredness and stress. In fact, we know a lot about postnatal depression in mums because it's been widely studied. When we talk about postnatal depression in mums, we're not talking about the baby blues. So the baby blues are a series of short-lived mood swings, irritability, sometimes coupled with insomnia. Whereas when we're talking about postnatal depression, we're really talking about a debilitating mental health condition. It's a non-psychotic a period of mental ill health characterized by an inability to experience joy, sometimes accompanied by low physical strength, but just generally a feeling of low self-esteem and low self-worth. When depression is diagnosed in about the year after a child is born, we typically refer to it as postnatal depression. This is a really important point. So clinical depression is not just feeling sad. It's not just feeling down. It is a serious debilitating condition that, if left untreated, often has negative consequences, not just for the individual, but for the other people within the family unit as well. In the UK, we know that between about 6 and 13% of new mums will experience postnatal depression. So a sizable percent of new mums will experience forms of postnatal depression. And postnatal depression in mums is really important because it can have all kinds of adverse effects, not just for the mum themselves, who will experience difficulties looking after the child, but also for the family unit in terms of the relationship with their partners, but most importantly in terms of negative effects for the child. For example, studies have suggested that children born to mums with postnatal depression are more likely to have learning difficulties, cognitive difficulties, behavioral difficulties, not just in the immediate term, but also in the longer term. And postnatal depression in mums is expensive. I don't often talk about the cost, the financial cost of postnatal depression, but it is expensive. So, for example, one study found that every single case of postnatal depression in mums in the UK costs the national economy about £74,000, with the bulk of those costs coming from looking after the adverse effects on their child. Now, the good news in terms of mums is that we know how to treat mums who have postnatal depression. There is long-standing good advice. It's long-standing national policy about how we treat mums and how we get them the help they need. But what about dads? Can dads get postnatal depression? Well, one of the great myths, I think, of postnatal depression is that dads are somehow immune to postnatal depression, that they simply can't get postnatal depression, that postnatal depression only affects mums. In fact, we now know this to be one of the great myths of postnatal depression. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that many dads will experience symptoms of depression following the birth of a child. In fact, studies suggest that between 8 and 11% of all new dads in the UK will experience postnatal depression. They may not be diagnosed with postnatal depression, but they will certainly experience symptoms of postnatal depression following the birth of a child. So why do we think that men are immune to postnatal depression? Well, I think one reason we think this is because of this idea that dads can't get postnatal depression because they don't experience neurochemical changes during pregnancy. This idea is rooted in a very biological view of depression. It's simply this view that men are completely immune to postnatal depression because they're not the ones who get pregnant. And it's pregnancy or the neurochemical changes that are associated with pregnancy that causes postnatal depression in mums. Even if you believe in this idea that depression is entirely biological, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that men, or dads rather, also experience neurochemical changes, not just post-birth, but also during their partner's pregnancy. For example, studies show that dads or potential dads, while their partners are pregnant, experience drops in testosterone, estrogen, prolactin. All of this has been documented. So there is evidence, even if you subscribe to this extreme biological view that postnatal depression is only affects mums, that dads experience or similar neurochemical changes which might place them at greater risk for postnatal depression. So this again is another myth of postnatal depression. Another great myth of postnatal depression is that dads can't get postnatal depression because they don't experience postnatal complications. Again, this view is based on this idea that mums might experience complications during birth or during the postnatal period, which makes it very difficult to subscribe to this view that dads will have similar complications. This is another myth. Obviously, dads don't experience pregnancy-related complications. What they might experience, though, is a feeling of helplessness when their partner is experiencing difficulties. They might experience difficulties understanding what their partner is going through, and all of that might place them at greater risk for postnatal depression. Now, this view is really important because it suggests that postnatal depression is not simply a biological issue. It is a social issue. It is a cultural issue, or all of the kind of experiences that some dads might go through following the birth of a child or in relation to their partner might place them at higher risk for postnatal depression. This is probably one of the kind of great myths of postnatal depression, that dads who say they have postnatal depression are simply just weak, or they're jealous, or they're narcissistic, or they're craving attention, or they're just jumping on a bandwagon. These are all things that people have said to me when I talk about my own experiences of postnatal depression, that I was weak, that I was just jealous of my partner, that I was just wanting some attention, or that I was trying to rob maternity services of much needed funding to be directed at men. Maybe I am weak, maybe I am jealous. What I find really interesting with these kinds of comments, though, is that we as a society are now much better at acknowledging the distress that lots of men will experience, particularly in terms of their mental health. And we give we give men a lot more space to talk about their mental health. But it still seems to be the case that when we talk about postnatal stress or postnatal distress specifically, we still stigmatize, we still penalize men who want to talk about their difficulties or who seek help for their difficulties. And I think part of the problem here is that we focus on this idea that providing help to men or providing help to dads somehow takes away help that could be provided to mums. Now, obviously, there may be some instances when we do need well-funded maternity services that can care for mums, but we also need well-funded services that look after the entire family unit. When a dad who's part of the family unit is struggling, when a dad is struggling with his mental health, it has an impact on the whole family unit. And so to dismiss those experiences of a dad is essentially to dismiss the experiences of the entire family unit. So what do we know about the causes of postnatal depression in dads? Well, one thing we do know is that dads whose partners have postnatal depression are about 2 to 3 times more likely to get postnatal depression themselves. Um, it's thought that the stress of caring for a partner who has postnatal depression increases the risk of dads getting postnatal depression themselves. In fact, the NHS now recognises this, and they're moving towards a system where dads whose partners have postnatal depression or mental illnesses in general, things like anxiety, schizophrenia, will get help, particularly will be screened for mental illnesses themselves. Another thing we do know is that dads who have a history of depression are about 20 times more likely to get postnatal depression. Now, this is really important, particularly from a healthcare perspective. If you have had a history of if you've had a history of depression, if you've had a history of mental illness, the likelihood that you will have postnatal depression or any kind of mental illness following the birth of a child increases quite dramatically. It's thought that the stresses and the stress that men experiences, combined with a genetic inheritance possibly for mental illness, but also all kinds of other causal factors in terms of depression combined following the birth of a child, and increases the risk that dads will struggle with their mental health. Finally, we also know that parents who report a discrepancy between what they expect in terms of postnatal life and the realities of postnatal life are much more likely to get postnatal depression. Now, to a degree, every new parent will recognize that what they expect and the realities of those of postnatal life will sometimes be quite huge. And this again goes back to this idea that we as a society talk about all the kind of positive things that happen about following the birth of a child, but we're not very good at talking about all the difficult things that happen when a child is born. And in particular, it seems that some men have difficulties reconciling this discrepancy between what they expected and what the realities of postnatal life are like. And one of the reasons we think this might be is because women generally have spend more time looking after other people's newborns, or they have greater experience being around newborn children, whereas dads don't really have those experiences, or don't generally have those experiences. They're not particularly common. Another reason is that men generally don't get the kind of information and don't get the kind of talks about experiences of postnatal life from their own parents. Lots of men, for example, talk about their own dads never having talked about what postnatal care will be like, what it will be like having to look after a newborn child. And all of that also may place men at a greater risk for postnatal depression. Men are also just less likely than women to spend time with their own newborn children, because of things like work, but also financial responsibilities. And there is a great deal of pressure, or at least perceived pressure, to keep going and to be the rock of the family. And all those kinds of pressures can mean that new dads often don't spend a lot of time with their newborn children. Now, some of these risk factors are actually very specific to men. Dads who report difficulties, particularly forming emotional bonds with their infant, are much more likely to get postnatal depression. And this is particularly true of dads who choose either not to take parental leave, or who don't spend very much time in active care for their newborn children. These dads typically report that they find it very difficult to form close emotional bonds with their children, and that those emotional bonds don't develop until much later on, particularly when the child is beginning to interact more effectively. Another key important thing here is that dads who feel that they don't have an emotional bond with their child are just less likely to do simple things with their children, like play, like reading them a story, kind of doing basic play with their child, or talking to them in a positive manner, all of which can help enhance these feelings that they're just helpless people standing by while their child is being cared by others. What we do know as well is that paternal postnatal depression, or postnatal depression in dads, increases the risk of self-harm and marital breakdown. In terms of self-harm, we know, for example, that 1% of all new dads who suffer from postnatal depression will end up taking their own lives. And that's really important. It's really important to emphasize this point because it highlights the difficulties and the negative outcomes that can occur when paternal postnatal depression is either ignored or minimized or made invisible. When we don't give men the space to talk about their difficulties, their psychological distress that they're experiencing, it can sometimes push them towards extreme responses like suicide. It can also mean they find it much more difficult to maintain a strong marital bond or a strong relationship with their partners, particularly if they don't feel supported within the family unit. There's also a lot of evidence to suggest that paternal postnatal depression has longer term and short term impacts on not just child bonding, but also child outcomes. For example, I've already mentioned some of the outcomes in terms of dads not wanting to play or not wanting to talk to, not wanting to read stories to their children. In the much longer term, there is also lots of evidence to suggest that children, particularly boys who are born to dads who have postnatal depression, are much more likely to suffer from learning, behavioral, and cognitive difficulties, particularly in adult life themselves. And we often don't talk about the costs of postnatal depression. Postnatal depression, particularly in dads, is also financially costly, not just for the families who are having to struggle with dealing with postnatal depression, but also for wider society. Several studies have shown that postnatal depression in dads, again, is incredibly expensive for the wider economy, particularly because of the impact that it has on health services having to deal with behavioral and clinical and cognitive difficulties in children. When we come back, I'll talk a bit more about what all of this means in terms of relating to men and how we can get men who are struggling with postnatal depression the help that they need.